This is the story of another terrible alleged case of Munchausen by internet. This case is still developing, and I think at the very least warrants a conversation. I'm talking about none other than Hope Otto. This is Hope Otto, who used her voice and her multiple chronic illnesses as a voice and a way to advocate for people with invisible illness. She claims that her life is greatly affected by chronic illness. These are some of the things she claims to suffer from. Feel free to pause to read. The list is pretty extensive, and it's important to note that the majority of these, if not all of them, are considered invisible illnesses or invisible disabilities. About 25% of Americans suffer from some form of this, and they face a ton of judgment and discrimination and shame. So what made Hope unique? So Hope claims that as a result of all of her disabilities, life was pretty miserable for her. Like she couldn't get through a day without fainting because of POTS syndrome, or puking because of her paralyzed stomach, or dislocating a joint because of her Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So she decided to pursue something called VSED, which means to voluntarily stop eating and drinking as a form of end-of-life care. And yes, you heard that right, which is essentially just a means to aid in your passing on. So something important to know about VSED is that it's usually reserved for people who are in hospice or are terminally ill and only have weeks or months to live. And it's a decision people make if systems have already shut down in their body, and it's kind of like a DNR. So it's kind of unheard of to hear that somebody who suffers from chronic illness is deciding to pursue this. Well, she went on TikTok and started talking about it, and it went viral. You know, that's a very provocative thing to say. And it's also very troubling because it can be incredibly seductive to a lot of invisible illness sufferers to slip into the ether because they're in so much pain all the time. She gained a pretty healthy following, explaining her decision to pursue VSED and cataloging all of her hospital visits. And it kind of seemed like she only posted when she was in the hospital. Like, I don't know. Well, some of her followers had some overly developed critical thinking skills, and they started asking follow-up questions. And naturally, holes started being poked in her story, which I will talk about in part 2. This is another terrible alleged case of Munchausen by internet, part 2. We are talking about Hope Otto. I recommend watching part 1 to catch up. So a little background on Hope. She is in her early 20s. She used to be a swimmer, and she used to be an EMT. But her life has been reduced to a series of hospital visits and plagued with chronic illness. So when people asked her follow-up questions to clarify her situation, she had incredibly inconsistent answers. A very common question is, when are you doing this? And the dates were always being pushed back. Not that anybody wants her to do this. And people close to her were refuting a lot of her medical claims. Hope said she was not able to eat or drink by mouth because of her conditions, so she was tube-fed as a result. Well, almost everybody who met her in person says that she can eat and drink just fine. Her good friend even said that in all the time that she spent with her, she never saw her dislocate a joint or faint. A big part of her content is also very critical of doctors and their unwillingness and inability to properly manage her pain. It's possible that they were sensing some drug-seeking behavior, and some of her followers were starting to get that vibe too. And in this behavior, it's really common to doctor shop until you find a doctor who's willing to prescribe you whatever you want. She started making TikToks and showing up in her personal life like very under the influence. She did a live on TikTok, and it was a disaster. It appeared she was very overly medicated and vaping while she's on oxygen. She apologized and tried to explain it away, but her credibility was definitely called into question. And it should have, because it turns out that she has a history of lying about her health conditions. It turns out a few years earlier she had cancer. Well, on the internet she did. What she did actually was she used her access as an EMT to steal brain scans of a cancer patient and present them as her own scans. She created a GoFundMe to raise money for her cremation services, but wound up using the money to buy a Jeep. She was actually selling merch during her TikTok stuff, and it was the same merch she used from her cancer days. That, coupled with the inappropriate information she was sharing on TikTok, resulted in her account being banned. Her Instagram is private, and she is being investigated for Medicare fraud for all of the hospice services she received. She spread a potentially harmful message to a vulnerable community. I hope she gets the help she needs, but I also hope she's held accountable. And that's Hope Otto.